late afternoon sun in Chiang, mice slanted through the shutters of John Merrick's guest house room, laying amber stripes across his suitcase as he zipped it shut for the last time. He was 60 now, white hair silvering at the temples, posture still straight from decades in uniform, but inside him, a boy of 15 stirred, jittery, with the same breath-catching anticipation he'd felt the summer he first came to Thailand. He could smell it again. Frangipani, river water, and the faintest trace of jasmine shampoo carried on humid air. It was the scent that had clung to Anong when she'd pressed a shy garland into his hand 45 years ago, and the scent he had chased halfway around the world to rediscover. John drew a slow breath, feeling the heat of the evening gather on his skin. The ceiling fan revolved lazily, pushing warm currents over his forearms. Sweat beaded in the crook of his elbow, and he smiled at the sensation. It reminded him that blood still rushed, still answered memory's call. Retirement had freed him, but it was the possibility, no, the promise of seeing her again, that made every heartbeat vivid, almost audible in his ears. Outside, motorbikes whined past the old teak house, and temple bells began their languid chorus. John closed his eyes. In the cool, distant corridors of recollection, he was 15 once more, standing on a dusty lane by the Ping River. Anong had laughed at his awkward tie, dark braid swinging like a metronome across her shoulders. She was 16, barely taller than him, barefoot in the sand, eyes bright as water at noon. When she reached out to guide his faltering pronunciation, her fingertips brushed his wrist. That touch, feather-light, deliberate, warmer than the sun, had thundered through him, as if every nerve ending leaned forward to listen. He remembered the tremor of her breath when, 2 weeks later, dusk hid them behind the boathouse. Cicadas screamed, river reeds bowed under a monsoon wind. Moonlight scattered over her cheekbones, and he saw a fine sheen of perspiration at her hairline. It had made her glow. His own breathing had gone ragged, chest tight, as he memorized the damp silk of her palm against his. Their first kiss was clumsy, teeth grazing, lips firm with teenage urgency. Yet the world had ceased to exist outside that soft collision. Even now his pulse fluttered at the recollection. The tentative slide of her fingers along the back of his neck, the gentle shiver that seized her shoulders when he whispered her name against her mouth. Then the summer ended. His parents' flight home could not be delayed, and promises, "I'll write, I'll come back," were swallowed by oceans and by time. Letters foundered somewhere between villages, wars, careers, and marriages charted divergent maps. But the memory of perspiration-pearled skin, of breaths mingling in jasmine-sweet air, had refused to fade. It had hovered in the margins of every year, every courtroom where he later practiced law, every winter morning when frost silvered the windows of his Chicago apartment. Now, with pension papers signed and obligations lifted, he was back where the story had paused. A tuk-tuk sputtered to a halt beneath his balcony. John's heart nudged his ribs at the childish thrill of motion, imminent reunion writ in the engine's idle clatter. He went downstairs, the cotton of his linen shirt whispering over sun-warmed arms, and climbed into the back. The vinyl seat was hot. It exhaled trapped heat that seemed to seep directly into the small of his back. He savored it, letting the warmth melt years of Midwestern chill. Wat Phra Singh, KH Rap, he told the driver. His voice surprised him, it quivered, though the old soldier in him steadied it with a slow exhale. Traffic unfolded like a lazy tide, pedestrians drifting, orange-robed monks gliding between jangling bikes. The air vibrated spice, exhaust, incense, and something sweet that tightened the back of John's throat. He thought of the curve of Anong's cheek turned toward him, how a secret smile had flickered there when she dared to lean closer. The tuk-tuk lurched around a corner, and the sudden motion coaxed a memory of her breath-catching little hitch, almost a gasp, as his thumb traced the damp hollow behind her ear that night by the river. He felt heat bloom low in his abdomen. The sensation was startling, like a match struck in a dim room. He noticed the way his fingers curled subtly against his knee, the slow inhale he took through parted lips. Even the fabric of his trousers felt different, alive against skin that had long forgotten anticipation. He shifted, muscles tightening, then relaxing, as he consciously lengthened each breath the way his old yoga instructor had taught him. In 4 counts, hold, out 6, the pulse that thrummed in his throat steadied, but did not diminish. It pulsed beneath the collar, in the hollow below his scarred clavicle, whispering of want rather than fear. When the temple's lion guardians finally appeared, stark white against twilight, John's breath stuttered again. This courtyard, its banyan roots coiling through ancient bricks, was where Anong had sold garlands to tourists all those years ago. He paid the driver, the pad of his thumb brushing the crisp edges of the bot. Even that small friction felt electric. He stepped out, knees momentarily stiff, but heart thrumming like a boy's. Lanterns swayed beneath the eaves. A novice monk's chanting rolled like warm water over stone. John pressed his palm to the wooden post at the gate, grounding himself. Somewhere inside, she waited. He was sure of it, though they had exchanged only 3 emails after he finally tracked down her niece last month. In those messages, her words were formal, but once she had typed, "I remember the river." That single line had sent a sharp, almost physical spark along his spine, and he'd reread it late at night, letting the syllables bloom into images of lips parted in humid darkness. The temple garden smelled of night-blooming jasmine, thick and heady. John's exhale shook. He followed the path of flagged stones toward the colonnade, where shadows gathered under gold-painted beams. His pulse hammered so strong he felt it in his fingertips. The sensation summoned that other memory, her fingers grazing his neck, nails barely raking, as if confirming that the boy before her was real and solid and hers. His skin tingled where phantom nails traced circles. A figure stepped from the shadows. Candlelight spilled over a woman in a pale blue blouse, hair coiled in a low knot. She was slight, posture graceful, but poised, as if bracing for something that both frightened and enticed her. When she lifted her face to the lanterns, John felt the ground tilt. The years had tempered the roundness of youth, sculpting something finer, cheekbones pronounced, eyes deep with stories he could not yet read. But in an instant, he recognized her. Anong's lips parted. For a heartbeat, neither moved. It was as if the humid air thickened, drawing them together on a silent tide. Then she inhaled a soft, tremulous breath that rose in her chest and quivered along her shoulders. John mirrored it involuntarily. The shared breath fused decades, braided them into a single filament of living sensation that thrummed between them, tugging them closer. He took one step. Lantern light caught the sheen of sweat at his temple. She took a matching step, the silk of her skirt whispering against her calves. John saw the fine shiver race over her forearms, down to her fingers, which curled toward her palms as if reaching. His own hands tingled, desperate to bridge the last breath of air between them. But he waited, let the delicious tension build, let it swell like tide before the crest. Anong, he said. The name on his tongue after so many years felt like the first mouthful of water after thirst. His voice rasped, low, carrying all the unsaid moments. Her smile was small, luminous. John, she answered, mouth shaping the syllable with reverence. The sound of it seemed to stroke him. He closed the space. Heat radiated from her skin. He felt it before they touched, like standing near a brazier on a chill night, the warmth irresistible. When he reached for her, it was slow, asking permission with each silent inch. She swayed forward. The back of his knuckles grazed her forearm, and the contact sent a pulse through them both. She drew a breath so deep her collarbone rose, shadowed and elegant. He watched the breath exit her lips, a quiet sigh that tasted like memory. Neither of them spoke. Words would have been noise over the quiet roar of shared sensation. Instead, John lifted her hand. Her fingers trembled. He felt the tiny tremor travel up his arm, stir the hairs at his nape. He pressed her knuckles to his lips. The air between them tightened, lantern halos blurred at the edges of his vision. She exhaled again, longer, body relaxing into the charged closeness. When her free hand touched his chest, broad palm settling over the steady pound of his heart, John's knees softened. A ripple of warmth flooded outward from that point of contact, coursing through ribcage, belly, thighs. He felt suddenly taller, younger, every sense sharpened. Her touch was light but decisive, as though she were testing old stone for cracks and finding it unmarred. The chanting behind them faded. Temple bells told the hour. Still they stood, breaths mingling, hands exploring only the map of fingers and cheekbones, but hearts galloping ahead to promises neither had dared frame aloud. The future pressed close, humid, scented, electric, and John felt the first thrill of something both tender and fiercely alive unfurl in his chest, as surely as jasmine opens after dark. Their reunion had begun, and the night around them waited, thrumming like a drumhead for the next beat. Lanterns flickered as a night breeze curled through the cloister, puffing the flame shadows over their faces. John felt Anong's pulse beneath his fingertips, quick, light, echoing his own, and the sweetness of that synchrony made every breath taste fuller. She tipped her head, glossy wisps escaping the neat knot at her nape. When he smoothed one filament away, the strand clung static, humid magnetism before obeying, and her eyelids fluttered like paper shutters in wind. They walked side by side down the temple steps, not touching, yet magnetized. His sleeve brushed the back of her hand. Her hip drifted an inch closer at each slow step until linen whispered against silk. With every stride, at street level, the city murmured, vendors calling, oil popping in woks. But the noise felt hushed, wrapped inside the hush of reunion. Anong paused beside a yellow songthieu. Instead of gesturing John inside, she reached for his forearm, thumb circling the faint groove where watch strap had once pressed. That small orbit of skin on skin sent a ripple up to his collar. "My house is near the river," she said, voice pitched low, as if the sentence itself required privacy. "We can take a boat, quiet." Her thumb stayed against his skin. The seconds stretched until the air between them warmed like a held breath. The river smelled of wet earth and moonlit algae. A long-tail boat rocked at the pier. Its deck lamp cast shallow pools of light that waltzed across the water. When John stepped aboard, Anong followed, the hem of her skirt grazing his calf. The pilot wordlessly pushed off, engine rumbling to a purr. They sat on a narrow bench, knees touching. At each vibration of the motor, her knee trembled against his. He answered by widening his stance, offering stability. She inhaled a soft, shaky sip of air, and her shoulder settled into the space beneath his arm. Instinctively, he curved around her, his breath sluicing through her hair, collecting the faint citrus of shampoo warmed by scalp. Water slapped the hull in lazy heartbeats. John's palm lay over her forearm now, thumb stroking along a vein that pulsed like a tiny drum. Each stroke lengthened, exploring the inside of her wrist where skin thins to petal softness. He felt her tremor, saw the way her chest rose a fraction deeper with each caress. When she turned her hand to interlace their fingers, her knuckles were warm, pliant, like clay softening in a sculptor's hold. Neither spoke during the drift downstream. Words would have been banal alongside the eloquence of joined pulses. Shadows of bamboo flickered over them. Occasionally, a halo of dock light revealed the silver at John's temples and the faint flush climbing Anong's throat. More than once her free hand lifted, hovered inches from his face, then settled almost shy on his jaw. The pad of her thumb traced the seam beside his mouth. He caught the soft hitch in her breathing when he angled his head to press a brief kiss into that exploring thumb pad. She exhaled on a quiver that fanned warmth across his cheek, and he felt her smile against the side of his neck. They disembarked at a small wooden dock. Crickets chirred so loudly the air seemed to crackle. Anong threaded her fingers tighter with his and led him up a stone path. Her teak house perched among banana trees inside. Slatted shutters welcomed river breeze. She lit one oil lamp, its glow tender as dawn. Golden arcs slid over her collarbones, highlighting a pulse flutter just below. John's gaze lingered, heat coiled low in his belly, as he watched that tiny movement, visible proof of her excitement, beat beneath warm skin. Dinner waited on a low table. Steamed jasmine rice, bowls of green curry, ripe mango slices glistening under syrupy glaze. They knelt on cushions, their knees touched again, a contact both casual and consuming. John lifted a spoonful of curry to her plate. She guided his wrist, her fingertips balancing his. When he withdrew, those fingers trailed up the inside of his forearm, slowing when goose flesh rose in their wake. She smiled, noticing he felt the smile like a physical stroke over bone. Conversation unspooled. His years in Chicago, her decades managing the temple's outreach school, the parents they had buried, the marriages that had ended in polite fades. Yet every sentence felt secondary to the current thrumming under the table where their legs remained side by side, calves pressing, releasing, pressing again. At one pause, she reached for mango, lifting the slice to his lips. Sweet juice touched his lower lip first. He watched her pupils widen at the sight. He closed his mouth around the fruit, bit, and her lower lip mirrored the motion. A drop of juice escaped. Without thinking, he brushed it away with his thumb and brought the thumb to his own mouth. The pulse in her throat leapt so vividly he thought he could hear it. Dishes cleared. Anong set a small radio on the sill. A Thai love ballad drifted out delicate strings, a soft male tenor. She extended a hand. John rose, knees creaking, but the stiffness melted as she drew him close. One palm found the center of his chest, smoothed down the line of buttons. The other hand slid to his shoulder. He guided his arm around her waist, so slender his fingers nearly overlapped. The first sway was tentative. He felt her abdomen brush his with each shift of weight, their breathing aligned. Inhale, step, exhale, turn. On one slow rotation, her forehead tipped to his chin. Warm breath pooled against his throat, and she exhaled a sigh so intimate it seemed to seep through his skin, settling behind his ribs. His hand drifted higher along her spine, mapping vertebrae, pausing where silk became the bare nape of her neck. He spread his fingers, feeling the precise shiver that traced her when his fingertips pressed lightly. She tightened her hold, chest rising until her breasts pressed fully against him, soft, an insistent promise. Heat flared, he swallowed, felt the swallow roll through his entire body. The song dissolved into nighttime hush. She drew back half an inch, enough to see him. Lamplight reflected in her eyes, liquid gold, widening. She lifted onto her toes. The brush of her lips was feather-like, cautious. He answered, lips meeting hers, with a deliberate slowness that let them taste every micro-shift. The first velvet touch, the subtle press, the gradual parting that invited deeper warmth. Her sigh spilled into his mouth. He felt it traverse his spine, loosening something deep in his lower back. When her hand slipped beneath his linen shirt, palm flattening over the curve of his waist, the heat of it seared straight through cotton. They broke the kiss only when breathlessness demanded. Foreheads together, they inhaled each other's exhale, a shared cycle looping like a quiet engine. John's thumb traced the hollow of her throat, feeling her pulse temper from a gallop to a canter. She slipped her fingers to his collar, undoing one button, then another slow, as if savoring the faint rasp of thread through cloth. Cool air licked the revealed skin her lips followed, planting a reverent kiss just below his clavicle. He exhaled on a shaky god, the word more vibration than sound. Anong took his hand, guided it to the first small knot of her blouse. He felt the fine tremor in her finger joints as she placed them over his. They stood motionless for 3 heartbeats, breath mingling, while decision crystallized in the hush around them. Then he tugged the knot loose. The fabric parted, lamplight kissed the newly bared slope of her collarbone, tracing downward into shadow. She drew a breath that lifted her entire frame into him, and her nails, a gentle warning, pressed at his waist, as though reminding him to go gently, to savor. He cupped the side of her neck, thumb stroking the pulse that raced there, and bent to kiss the place where skin gleamed deepest. She arched, a silent request. Somewhere beyond the shutters, a gecko chirped. The sound felt absurdly distant compared to the hiss of her inhale. His other hand found the small of her back, guiding her toward the bedroom doorway, only a few steps away. They moved slowly, bodies gliding like leaves on a current, pausing every few inches for another kiss, another lingering brush of lips over jaw, temple, shoulder. At the threshold she paused, fingers splayed against his chest, breathing in soft, irregular surges. He traced a circle at her waist, waited. She nodded once, eyes luminous. They crossed into the darker room where moonlight pooled in rectangles across the floorboards. The door eased shut behind them with a hushed click, a conspiratorial seal. Inside that stillness, clothing surrendered in stages, each rustle sounding loud as surf. Cotton sliding from skin, silk sighing onto the floorboards, little private thunderclaps marking the uncovering. When they finally pressed body to body, the sensation was startling, warm satin over heated stone. John felt her breath catch against his ear, tight and high, then spill out in an unsteady moan, barely louder than the river outside. He answered with a tremor that rocked him forward, palms braced at her hips, thumbs drawing idle circles that tightened each time her abdomen quivered. They moved together onto the low futon, settling amid tangled linens that smelled faintly of lemongrass. Their conversation became wordless, the firm slide of calf against calf, the glide of fingertips mapping ribs, the groan that rolled out of him when her lips trailed from his earlobe to the hollow of his throat. Each sound, each shifting press of skin, was a promise spoken in a language they had waited nearly half a century to remember. And when at last the hush deepened, breaths coming in short, sharp bursts, hearts drumming so fast the beats felt fused, the moonlight witnessed only silhouettes, bodies arching toward a crescendo written in shiver and sigh rather than speech. Afterward, they lay still while their breathing slowed, matching once more. John listened to the rhythm settle, felt it pulse where her palm rested over his heart. In that quiet cadence, he heard the murmur of river water, the distant chime of a temple bell marking the hour, and beneath it all, the steady, patient drum of a future beginning, as sure as dawn edging the horizon. A pink-blushed dawn seeped through the shutters, striping the bedroom walls with ribbons of quiet light. John woke first, drifting up from dreams so saturated with Anong's scent that for a moment he could not separate memory from the present. Then he felt her warm weight tucked against his side, one thigh draped across him, skin smooth as river-worn stone. Her breathing was the soft, even rhythm of deep sleep, each exhale puffing warmth against the hollow beneath his shoulder. He lay still, letting that breath fan over him, feeling its gentle tick, tick tick mark time far more tenderly than any clock. When the temple drum rumbled in the distance, Anong stirred. John felt a flutter along her lashes, then the subtle flex of muscles as she stretched. Her thighs slid, silk against coarse hair, and a tiny hum escaped her throat, half sigh, half cat-like purr. He turned just enough to watch her eyes open, slow, languid, irises dark as the river at night. The first thing she did was smile, and that smile rippled through him, waking every nerve he owned. "Good morning," he whispered, voice gravelly. She answered with fingers tracing the silver at his temple, nails grazing lightly enough to raise gooseflesh. "I like your morning voice," she murmured, the words vibrating through the small space where her palm now rested over his collarbone. He felt the tremor in her hand as she explored the slope of his chest, mapping ridges of muscle softened but not lost. Her fingertips paused at the steady drum of his heart, and she seemed to listen, eyes half-lidded. He covered her hand with his, pressing it closer so she could feel the full force of that beat. Hunger knotted inside him, hunger that was as much for the comfort of her nearness as for the heat they had shared in darkness. He leaned to kiss her forehead, lips lingering long enough to feel the cool warmth paradox that is early morning skin. She breathed in sharply, as though drawing the kiss deeper. Her thigh tightened around his hip, urging him closer. But instead, he rolled onto his back, bringing her with him so she lay sprawled across his chest, the full press of her soft curves settling into the planes of him sent a muted thrill through every inch. He wrapped an arm around her waist, palm riding the curve of spine until it found the dip above her hips. There he traced idle circles, each orbit coaxing a faint shiver that traveled up her back and surfaced in a sigh against his neck. Minutes drifted past in wordless communion. Breaths exchanged, pulses synchronized, fingertips wandering the most ordinary places, forearm, shoulder blade, the fine edge of jaw, yet sparking extraordinary warmth wherever they touched. When at last she pushed herself up, hair tumbling in loose waves down her back, the sheet slid to her waist. The gleam of dawn caught on her collarbones, and John's breath stuttered the way it had the first time he'd seen sunrise slant over the Mekong decades ago, awed, grateful, stirred by something older than speech. "Stay," he said, voice barely sound. "I am," she answered, and bent to brush her lips over his. But light was swelling outside. Vendors would soon fill the street, and life would intrude. She rose, knotting the sheet around her like a makeshift sarong. John watched muscles ripple under skin as she crossed to the shutter and pulled it wider. The scent of frying dough and strong coffee drifted in with the morning air. It mingled with the still lush smell of last night, lemongrass soap, sweat cooled on pillows, tangled jasmine in her hair. He swung his legs over the futon, the floorboards cool beneath sole and heel. Age announced itself with a faint protest in his knees. Anong heard the catch of his breath and turned, worry knitting briefly between her brows. He smiled it away, crossing the room to her. The sheet rustled as he circled her waist from behind, palms flattening over her stomach. She leaned back, and the top of her head found the hollow beneath his chin. They stood like that, cradle and anchor, while morning unfolded outside. When his thumbs brushed the ridge of her ribs, her breath hitched, shoulders lifting in that same delicate arc that never failed to unravel him. They dressed slowly, each button, each knot of fabric an excuse for small touches, her palm gliding beneath his sleeve to straighten a cuff, his fingers smoothing the back of her blouse, lingering at the clasp until she gave a soft, impatient laugh and stepped backward into him, so his hands had to settle, possessive, at her waist. Afterward, he followed her through the house, the domesticity feeling surreal, yet wondrous, like slipping into a story he'd longed to inhabit. Breakfast was taken on the veranda, overlooking the river. Sunlight flashed off ripples. Long-tailed boats began their slow churn north. Anong set out sticky rice and grilled bananas, whose caramelized skin steamed when torn. She perched beside him on the bamboo bench, thigh pressed to his, sharing the same bowl of condensed milk for dipping. Each time she lifted a banana piece to his mouth, her other hand steadied his knee, and each steadying touch was a little caress that lingered longer than necessary, thumb stroking slow arcs that grew bolder as conversation drifted to softer places. They spoke of futures in tentative sketches. Another visit to the temple that evening, a drive to see her sister's village in a few days, maybe a stop at a clinic she trusted, just to explore possibilities. She said, chin ducking shyly. The notion arrested him. He felt it like a sudden uptick of wind. At 60, fatherhood had seemed a chapter closed. Yet here on a sun-warmed bench with her hip nudging his and hope shining in her gaze, the idea of children did not feel absurd. It felt astonishingly alive. He slid a finger under her chin, lifting until their eyes met. If there's still a chance, he said, voice husky, I'd like to try. His thumb brushed the delicate skin below her lower lip. She shivered, a quick, visible tremor that sparked in her shoulders and radiated outward, then smiled so wide the edges crinkled. She caught his thumb in a kiss, hot and sudden, teeth grazing the pad lightly before she released it. They finished breakfast, yet neither made move to rise. Heat climbed with the sun, syrup slow, rendering the air heavy and sweet. Sweat beaded at John's temple. Anong's gaze tracked the droplet as it slipped toward his jaw. She reached, fingertip catching the bead, then lifted it to her own lips with playful solemnity. The gesture punched breath from his lungs. He set the bowl aside, cupped her face, and kissed her so deeply the river seemed to hush. When they parted, both were breathing fast, shoulders lifting and falling in imperfect synchrony. Anong rose first, holding his hand, tugging him back through the house to a smaller room lined with woven mats and stacks of folded textiles. She slid the door shut. In the dappled half-light from the high window, color spilled across her cheeks. Without a word, she guided him to sit, then knelt to unlace his shoes, slow, deliberate, grazing each ankle with reverent fingertips. The intimacy of so simple an act, her breath warm through the linen as she bent. The soft exhale each time she tugged, tightened sensation low in his belly. He reached for her, but she lifted a hand, bidding patience. She set his shoes aside and began to bundle textiles, silk scarves, cotton throws into a makeshift pallet on the floor. Each movement was fluid, hips swaying, shoulders rolling beneath thin fabric. John's pulse climbed watching her. When she finally knelt on the pallet and beckoned, his breath came short. He joined her, knees brushing, the faint rasp of cotton against cotton loud in the hush. She guided his arms around her from behind, positioning them both so that her back rested against his chest. Legs folded together, the embrace was close, encompassing. He felt every inhale expand her ribs into his palms, felt the tremor that began low in her abdomen when his thumbs stroked tiny circles there. He dipped his head, nuzzling the curve where neck meets shoulder. Her responding sigh vibrated through his sternum. The world contracted to breathe and heartbeat. Her breath, his heartbeat, trading places, until he could not tell which thump belonged to whom. Minutes stretched, pliant and molten, when at last she shifted, hips pressing back, spine arching into him. A moan climbed unbidden from his throat. She answered with a whisper of his name that cracked on the vowel, and the hush around them filled with the subtle sound of fabric sliding over skin as they sought more contact. It was not frantic. It was deliberate, measured like a ritual. Every glide of palm, every shiver of breath, stoked the ember they'd banked since dawn, and when that ember finally flared, it did so slowly, gracefully, igniting them without hurry, until they lay entwined again, glistening in the warm morning light, hearts thudding slow, victorious drums against the shared drumhead of their joined bodies. Afterward, they did not hurry to dress. Instead, they lay on the quilts, limbs tangled, letting perspiration cool in the river breeze. Outside, children's voices floated from the alley, rooster crow echoing. John traced idle patterns along Anong's forearm, constellations only he could see, and wondered if somewhere, in the tapestry of futures unfolding, tiny feet might one day patter in this very hall. The idea set his heart knocking with a young man's fervor. Anong heard it and smiled, curling closer, as though tucking herself around the sound to keep it safe. By mid-afternoon, a haze steeped the city, wrapping buildings in pale gold and urging everything to slow. Anong packed an overnight bag while John borrowed her scooter, returning with fresh orchids looped around the handlebars, and 2 chilled bottles of coconut water he held against her nape, until she squeaked and spun into his arms. There, amid loose-limbed laughter, lips grazed temples, and the noon heat folded around them like a heavy quilt, sealing each touch with sticky warmth. They set out just after 3, Anong riding pillion. The scooter vibrated beneath them, a thrumming countertempo to the drumming of John's heart when her arms cinched his waist. Each curve of road leaned their bodies closer. Her breath fanned the linen on his back, a soft rhythm that rose whenever the bike accelerated and fell into tiny sighs as it glided. Once, on a straight stretch lined with bougainvillea, she flattened her palms over his stomach and slid them higher, fingertips spanning his ribcage. The gesture, so casual yet intimate, made his inhale catch hard enough that she felt it. She pressed a kiss to the back of his neck, and the wind seemed to hush in deference. 2 hours north, the asphalt surrendered to red dirt. Anong's sister lived in a stilted teak house tucked among jackfruit trees. Children's voices drifted like birdsong above the hum of cicadas. When they arrived, Anong introduced John with both hands around his, presenting him the way one might present an honored relic. The sister, Sai, bowed politely, then broke into a grin wide enough to show the gap where a childhood candy had cost her a tooth. Her toddler clung to her hip, huge brown eyes fixed on John, as if recognizing some half-imagined grandfather from bedtime tales. When he crouched and offered a wooden frog toy he'd bought in the market, the child's hesitant fingers curled around his, and Anong's hand settled on his shoulder, light, grateful, possessive. Dinner unfolded beneath a corrugated awning, while dusk painted the sky bruise purple. Sai's husband grilled tilapia over coconut husks, the fish hissed, scent mingling with lemongrass and smoke. Every so often Anong's arm brushed John's, and the sparks those brushes struck were visible only to them, a widening of her pupils, a flush creeping above his collar. The family spoke mostly Thai, yet John caught fragments, laughter, affectionate teasing about weddings and babies. Whenever the conversation turned that way, Anong's thumb stroked the inside of his wrist, a silent question he answered with an answering squeeze, pulse thrumming under her touch. After dishes were cleared, Sai walked them to a small guest hut at the edge of a rice field. Fireflies bobbed over the water, pinpricks of wandering starlight. Inside, a single mosquito net hung over a reed mat. The walls exhaled the day's stored warmth. Anong lit a candle set in a clay bowl. Its flame jittered, spilling amber over her cheekbones. John felt the hush tighten around them, as though the air itself leaned closer to listen. He slipped behind her, arms circling, palms fitting the subtle flare of her hips. She leaned back, eyes closing, and her exhale trembled through both of them, one of those breaths that starts deep in the belly and emerges part sigh, part invitation. His lips traced the curve of her shoulder, where blouse met skin. Tiny bumps rose under each kiss. The candle crackled. Outside, frogs chanted a thick, pulsing chorus that seemed to echo the pulse, now thudding beneath his own sternum. They moved together onto the mat, never rushing. The slow peel of linen from skin, the rustle of cotton sliding past knees, each discarded layer a gentle thud on woven floor. Moonlight seeped through bamboo slats, banding them in silver. John's fingers found the hollow at the base of her spine. He drew small circles, feeling muscles ripple beneath. Her answering breath hitched a fragile, melodic sound. She guided his hand lower, then paused, eyes shining in half-light, ensuring consent was not just given, but celebrated. He kissed the question off her lips, shaping assent with the press of his body and the rise of his pulse against her palm. When they came together, it was unhurried, a languid tide rolling toward shore. No swift crash, only the endless gliding forward and back of water-smoothing sand. His hands mapped the melody of her ribs expanding. Her nails traced the bass line along his shoulder blades. Breath braided with breath, moan folding into moan, until neither knew whose sound answered whose. At climax, it was not a shout, but a single shared gasp, sharp, bright, swallowed by the hush of night, and the soft collapse of bodies settling like petals after rain. Later, lying inside a tent of gauzy netting, they watched fireflies drift beyond the slats. Sweat cooled between them, yet they stayed pressed belly to back, her heel hooked behind his calf, as if anchoring the moment. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "The clinic is open after noon." Her fingers traced the tendons at his wrist, pausing where pulse fluttered. "They will do a simple test." A thrill, equal parts hope and nerves, skittered through him. "I'll be there," he said, voice soft but steady. He turned, gathering her closer so their foreheads touched. In that small space, he could taste the faint salt of her skin, feel each exhale fan his lips. Sleep tugged at them, but neither wished to surrender the waking quiet. They spoke in murmurs, favorite childhood songs, the way the river changes color before monsoon, the smell of wet earth that always reminded him of her long ago garland. Between sentences, silence settled, not awkward, but plush, filled by the rustle of their shared breathing and the distant hiss of rice stalks swaying under moonlight. When at last her words slowed into drowsy hums, he pressed a final kiss to her pulse. "Rest," he murmured. She answered with an assent that was half yawn, half giggle, then nestled deeper, her palm sliding beneath his shirt to rest over his heart. The simple warmth of that touch lulled him. In his last waking moment, he pictured the future, sketched earlier tiny hands, laughter ricocheting off teak walls, and felt his chest expand around the impossible sweetness of it, the way dawn air swells with birdsong before the first light even shows. A pale saffron light crept over the paddies, coaxing mist from the water and urging the world awake with quiet insistence. John rose first, easing from beneath the mosquito net so as not to disturb Anong's slow, melodic breathing. The air held a lingering coolness. Gooseflesh lifted along his arms as he tugged on linen trousers. But when he bent to tuck the sheet around her bare shoulders, her hand emerged, sleep-warm, and closed around his wrist. The softness of that grip, the way her fingertips molded to the cords of muscle under aging skin, sparked a pulse that traveled up to the base of his skull. She opened her eyes, a slow unfurl, lashes parting like petals soaked in dew, and smiled so gently it seemed the morning existed solely for that expression. Without words, she tugged him down. Knees sank into the reed mat, lips met. Her breath still carried the languor of dreams, a warm exhale that slipped into his mouth and made his pulse stutter. Their kiss deepened until she hummed, a little vibration in her throat that resonated against his sternum, then eased back, fingertips brushing the silver at his temple. "We should not be late," she whispered, voice husky with the echo of sleep. He nodded, forehead resting against hers, letting their shared breath linger until it fogged lightly between them. Even that faint condensation felt intimate, a visible sign of mingling life. They washed at the outdoor basin, pouring cool ladles of water over each other's shoulders. Each splash beaded into rivulets that chased collarbones, and every rivulet earned a following caress. When he slid a damp palm down her spine, she arched, water scattering in a glitter of droplets. Her laugh was low, glimmering. It trembled as his thumb traced the groove where shoulder blades tapered. Heat coiled in his belly, but she set a soft kiss to his wet chest, steadying, promising more later, before wrapping herself in a vivid sarong that clung to curves still slick from rinsing. The small public clinic sat off a dusty road on the town's edge. Ceiling fans chopped the air inside, scattering the scent of hibiscus disinfectant. John filled out forms, pen trembling imperceptibly when he wrote his birth year. Anong smoothed her hand over the back of his neck, thumb pressing the tense muscle where worry had settled. The tiny pressure felt like a command to breathe. He obeyed, scenting her faint jasmine amidst the iodine and latex. Blood was drawn first, a polite pinch at the crook of his elbow, then a discreet side room for the more humbling sample. Anong waited just outside, humming a lullaby tune he almost recognized. He focused on that sound, let it guide him through self-consciousness until the task was complete. When he stepped out, she rose and threaded her fingers through his. No words, just the fine tremor of her grip telling him she understood. Her own examination followed. John sat, knees jiggling, listening to muffled Thai beyond the curtain, soft questions, Anong's replies, the crisp rustle of paper gowns. Every so often he caught the inhale-pause-exhale cadence of her breath, steady but quickened in unfamiliar sterility. He pictured her lying under harsh fluorescence, remembered the curve of her waist against his palms hours earlier, and a surge of protectiveness swelled so fierce it silenced the clatter of his thoughts. At last, the nurse parted the curtain. Tests would take days. Preliminary scans looked healthy, she said with a kind tilt of her head. Anong emerged buttoning her blouse, cheeks flushed either from blush or chilled gel wiped away. John rose, the instinct to gather her close overrode decorum. He drew her into his arms right there in the corridor, one hand cradling the nape of her neck. The antiseptic air thinned around them. For a breath or two, the hallway fell quiet as her heartbeat thudded against his ribs. Outside, noon heat hit like a living thing. Cicadas screeched, jackfruit leaves trembled. They walked toward a shaded market, shoulders brushing. John's mind swirled with possibilities, hope, doubt, the arithmetic of age. Anong tightened her grip, steering him to a stall where a vendor carved chilled watermelon into crescents. She pressed a piece to his lips. Juice burst, sweet and ice-cold, trickling down his chin. She caught the drop with her thumb, lifted it to her mouth, and sucked slow, deliberate. The sight dried his throat more thoroughly than the sun. He took the next slice and repeated the gesture, tracing her lower lip with cool juices until she shivered. Lashes fluttering closed, they wandered deeper among stalls. The crush of ripe mango, sizzling satay, incense smoke curling skyward. Each smell layered over the other, heady and thick. Beneath it all, he tracked the subtler perfume rising from Anong's sun-warmed skin. At a booth selling silk scarves, she lifted one sea-green length, brushing it over the inside of his forearm. The fabric whispered over sensitive skin. He felt the fine hairs lift, a visible tide of sensation. Her eyes held a private luster, half laughter, half hunger. He paid the vendor and draped the scarf around her shoulders. She stepped into the loop so his arms circled her. The silk became a tether pulling pulling them heart to heart amid the market chaos. By late afternoon, they returned to the guest hut for a rest before the long ride. But inside, the hush felt charged, the silence between them humming like wires. Anong set the scarf on the mat, then sat and gathered it into her lap, fingers sliding along its length as if assessing its strength. "Will you help me?" she asked, gaze steady. He knelt. She guided his hands, twisting the silk into a loose rope, then wound it around his wrists, nothing restraining, just firm enough to feel. Her breath fanned his cheek. It smelled of sweet basil candies she'd nibbled on the ride back. When the last loop lay snug, she kissed the inside of his forearm, where pulse jumped fast. The feather-warm press of her lips sent a shiver spiraling outward down his spine, along locked fingers. Cooling low, she eased him onto his back, wrists still wrapped but free to move. The hue of the scarf contrasted with sun-browned skin, and the sight struck him as strangely beautiful age and desire framed in jewel-toned silk. Anong straddled his hips, sarong slipping higher with the motion. The thin cotton molded to her thighs. As she leaned forward, it tightened across her body, outlining every curve. His breath caught. She placed her hands over his bound wrists. The silk allowed movement, but its gentle confinement sharpened every sensation, focusing him wholly on her weight, her warmth. The scent of coconut oil recently smoothed over her shoulders. She bent, hair falling in dark cascades that tickled his face. Her lips traced a path from earlobe to collarbone, pausing at each ridge of his sternum. With every kiss, breath burst from him in short, involuntary sighs. She answered each sound with an answering press of hips, a measured pressure that built, receded, built again, like waves coaxing shoreline sand into new shapes. The scarf tightened slightly when he flexed. Silk rasped softly, reminding him to yield, to feel rather than grasp. When she finally loosened the knot and his arms freed, he surged up, reversing their positions with a fluidity that surprised them both. She laughed, a husky, breathless sound, but the laugh cut off in a gasp as he kissed the hollow of her throat where pulse thrummed. He released the scarf, letting it trail cool across her abdomen. The fabric drew a shiver that rolled through her like wind over rice stalks. He followed the shiver with his mouth, slow, reverent, until her breaths shortened into quick, high exhalations. They moved in leisurely rhythm, unhurried as afternoon shade creeping across a field. When peak finally arrived, it was silent save for one shared exhale that seemed to draw the heat from the day and trap it between their joined bodies. They stilled, limbs tangled, the scarf pooled like a small vivid sea beside them. Later they lay side by side, sweat cooling, hearts decelerating from gallop to trot. John lifted her hand, pressing a kiss to the soft pad below her thumb. "Whatever the tests say," he murmured, "you are already all the future I need." Her eyes glimmered, not tears exactly, more like the shine of moon on deep water. She rolled to face him fully, palm sliding over the rise of his shoulder, down the line of his forearm to intertwine their fingers. "And you are my tomorrow," she whispered. The words were simple, but the tremor in her voice carried the weight of promise. Evening shadows stretched long across the hut, cicadas began their twilight hymn, wrapped in a hush thick with salt-sweet skin and unspoken vows. They dozed, cradled by distant frog song and the slow, certain turning of the earth toward night. A violet hush still blanketed the Paddies when they rolled away from Sai's village, but already the horizon glimmered pearl pink. Anong nestled behind John on the scooter, arms circled tight around his middle. The road was empty. Only wind and birdsong shared the dawn. With each rise and dip of the dirt track, her chest pressed against his back in a tender, rhythmic percussion. He swore he could feel her heart through linen, steady, swift, a counterbeat to the thrum of the engine. When sun finally broke like a yoke over the hills, gold spilled across their shoulders. John slowed to watch its first blaze catch in her hair, reflected in his mirror. He reached one hand behind him, fingers finding the trim line of her thigh, and squeezed in silent greeting. She answered by flattening her palms to his ribs, a wordless promise that even the wide road could not loosen their knot. They reached Chiang Mai just as the city yawned awake. Broom strokes whisked last night's petals off temple steps. Vendors unrolled canvas roofs that snapped in the new light. At a riverside cafe, they claimed a bamboo booth half hidden by potted orchids. The copper smell of strong Thai coffee mingled with river mist. Anong poured 2 cups, then wrapped both her hands around John's, guiding the warm porcelain to his lips. The intimacy of that simple gesture, steam kissing his face while her thumb stroked the back of his knuckles, made the small hairs on his arms lift as if greeted by a breeze. Halfway through the 2nd cup, her phone chimed. The sudden sound felt sharp as broken ice. She met his gaze. In those few silent seconds, he read hope and fear running side by side like twin currents. Answering, she pressed the speaker close so he could hear. A nurse's voice, soft, lightly accented, delivered the results. His number's a bit low for a man of 60, she said gently, yet still within the realm of possibility. Lifestyle, timing, patience, the nurse advised. For Anong, all was clear. Her body waited, ready. Anong's shoulders sagged, the relief so palpable John felt it echo in his own chest. Then she looked at him, eyes luminous, half asking if possible was enough. He took her face in both hands, pressing a kiss to her brow. "We built a bridge over 45 years, he murmured. "We can cross a narrow river." Her exhale trembled across his palms. She leaned forward until their foreheads touched, breaths mingling in a humid pocket that smelled of jasmine and roasted beans. The rest of the morning unfolded in small, companionable errands. Herbs from a healer's stall, silken baby blue yarn that made them both blush, and finally, a stop at the temple where they had first reunited. A monk blessed 2 plated string bracelets, knotting them around their wrists, with chants low as thunder, muttering on distant hills. John felt every syllable vibrate through Anong's shoulder into his own, as if the blessing traveled body to body before settling in their joined hands. Twilight found them on the old iron footbridge that spans the Ping. Warm lamplight braided through the metal lattice, striping their faces in gold and shadow. Children upstream launched krathong, tiny rafts of banana stem decked in marigolds and candles. Anong had prepared her own. She lit the wick, flames shivered, caught. Together they lowered the floating blossom until river current tugged it free. As it drifted, John slipped behind her, arms crossing over her waist, chin dropping to her shoulder. They watched the candle bob away, an orange star on indigo water, while his thumbs made lazy circles against the soft rise of her abdomen, as though memorizing future shape. The night air thickened to velvet. Cicadas fell quiet, giving way to the bass croak of toads along the bank. Anong turned in the cage of his arms, eyes reflecting twin points of bridge light. When she spoke, her voice was barely breath. "Take me home." Not a question, an invocation. They walked to the guest house, fingers laced. Inside, the room glimmered with a dozen tea candles she'd tucked among clay pots earlier. Shadows undulated on the walls like slow dancers. John eased the door shut. The click felt ceremonial. He reached for her scarf, but she caught his wrists, guiding his hands instead to the neat folds of her blouse. Silk whispered as buttons slipped free, each tiny release loosening something inside him. With every button, she inhaled, chest lifting beneath his knuckles. With every exhale, fabric parted wider, until dawn-pale skin emerged, glowing in candlelight. He draped the blouse over a chair, then paused, letting his gaze travel the lines age and sun had inked on her shoulders, the subtle flare of hip where sarong clung. She returned the study, palms following the road map of scars and stories across his torso. When her finger traced the white slash from an old skiing mishap, he shivered. Her lips followed the route, a silent pledge to cherish every mile already traveled. They met in the center of the room, two slow tides converging. Her sarong loosened under his patient tug and puddled at their feet. She rose on tiptoe, their bodies aligned, warm skin striking warm skin. The contact stole his breath. She felt it and smiled against his mouth, then coaxed him backward toward the low bed. Mattress dipped, candles flickered like startled fireflies. What followed was deliberate, luxuriant. The glide of calf over calf, the muted gasp when her fingertips sought the tender hollow behind his knee, the way his palm cradled the nape of her neck as though holding a fragile bird. They moved unhurriedly, savoring each blooming ripple of sensation. When at last he entered her, neither spoke, only their breathing conversed, his a deep, rolling hum, hers a staccato of quicksilver sighs. Pace built by increments, a held breath, a small shift of hips, a widening tremor in her thighs beneath his palms. Climax came soft as silk tearing, no sharp cry, just a collective breath sucked in, held, then spilled together on a single broken exhale. They remained joined, foreheads pressed, while heartbeat after heartbeat slowed from gallop to lope. Outside, temple drums announced the 9th hour. The pulse seemed to echo inside them, steady and ancestral. When they finally separated, John stretched out and drew her against his chest. Candlelight licked the fine sheen of sweat on her temple. He brushed it away, fingertips skimming like a comet tail across damp skin. She sighed, content, replete. Yet beneath the softness, he sensed a subtle, quivering spark, hope bright and urgent as the lotus candle drifting somewhere downstream. They talked in murmurs until wax pools cooled, about prenatal herbs the healer recommended, about names that stitched English and Thai syllables into single melodies, about a larger house near Size, where children could race between river and rice field. With each idea, Anong's palm slid over his heart, as though confirming that the rhythm there matched the drum of her own imagining. Candles guttered, leaving only moonlight. It spread across their twined bodies in pale ribbons, silvering the dark, downy hair on his forearm, gilding the slope of her waist. As they drifted toward sleep, John pressed one last kiss to her wrist, where the monk's blessed string rested, a small white line that bound them to their shared tomorrow. In the hush just before dreams, he felt her belly rise beneath his hand, felt his own breath fall into perfect cadence, and realized the river beyond the shutters was singing the same slow lullaby they had carried across decades, a low, persistent promise that some currents, once joined, never part again. Morning after morning, the river carried a thin silver mist past their shutters, and each dawn found John and Anong still woven together, ankles loosely hooked, palms curved into the smalls of backs, as though they might mold their shapes into one. They had begun to mark time not by clocks, but by the supple rhythms of their bodies, the slow, luxuriant waking, the mid-afternoon doze that melted into idle exploration of freckles and laugh lines, the velvet hush of night when the world retreated and only heartbeats spoke. 10 days slid by like warm oil, visits to market, whispered jokes over cooking pots. The cool jolt of holy water splashed playfully down spines. Beneath every ordinary hour thrummed a shared, urgent purpose. At sunset, they brewed the healer's tea, ginger sweet and musky, with longan bark, sipping it from a single cup, so each swallow tasted faintly of one another. And always, when darkness sealed the house, they tested the bounds of possibility. One rain-soaked evening, thunder roamed the hills, and the power blinked out. Candlelight fidgeted in glass jars, glinting off drops that threaded down the window. John watched the lamplight ripple across Anong's damp shoulders as she unpinned her hair. Water slid along the sleek arc of her neck. He followed it with his thumb, heat blooming low in his belly. When she tipped her head to invite more, she turned, pressing her rain-cooled dress against his chest. The chill shocked his skin, but the warmth beneath the thin cotton made him inhale sharply, lungs filling with a scent of rainwater, jasmine, and living skin. They undressed each other by feel, cloth peeling away in languid drifts, every fresh inch of exposure sending tiny goosebumps skittering across flesh, already throbbing with storm-born electricity. Lightning flashed. For a heartbeat, he saw her framed in quicksilver, pupils wide, lips parted, chest trembling on the cusp of a breath too deep to finish. He kissed her, then mouth gentle but insistent, and her answering moan rose like the low roll of thunder outside. Each soft sound curved into him, nudging him toward the edge of control until they were lowering themselves to the cool floorboards, bodies aligning in the flicker dark. He gathered her wrists, guiding them above her head, not to bind, but but to anchor them both in the slow, tidal rhythm he set. She matched him breath for breath. Inhale with the long glide in, exhale with the slow retreat, until lungs and pulses and hip bones moved to the same patient cadence. When climax came, it spread through them like the distant storm, a warm, rolling thunder that began in her quickened whimper, spilled into his broken sigh, and faded into the hush between raindrops. Afterward, they lay cheek to cheek, the scent of wet earth drifting through the shutters. Anong rested her palm on her lower belly. John covered her hand with his, feeling the faint flutter of her pulse under their joined warmth. She whispered, "Tomorrow will be 2 weeks." He pressed a kiss where their hands met, letting the promise of that timeline settle like a seed in dark soil. At dawn, they rode to the clinic again. The city shimmered clean after the storm. Puddles flashed sky blue under the sun. Waiting, John traced the seam of her blouse with a fingertip, memorizing its path, so his nerves had something steady to follow. Anong's breaths came quick, but even each exhale fanned his wrist where their fingers tangled. When the nurse finally returned, she carried a sealed envelope, smiling without speaking. Anong's hands shook just enough for John to feel the tremor before she stilled them with a purposeful breath. She nodded to him, and together they broke the seal. 2 pink lines. The air seemed to tilt. For one impossible second, sound vanished, and all John could hear was the hard, jubilant pounding inside his own chest. Anong's breath hitched, turned into a laugh that spilled over into a sob. He caught her face between shaking palms, tears springing hot behind his lids as he tried to speak and found only breath. So he kissed her once on each eyelid, once on the tip of her trembling nose, once on the smile quivering against his mouth. She tasted of salt and wonder. Outside, in the sunlit courtyard, they found a quiet bench. She perched on his lap, arms circling his neck, forehead pressed to his. Breaths mingled her swift, high, shivery, his deep, rolling, steadying them both. He laid a reverent hand over her abdomen. Already, the thought of life stirring there sent a ribbon of heat spiraling through him, different from desire yet kin to it. A fierce, protective warmth that rooted in the base of his spine and spread to every limb. That night, they celebrated with Sai's family. Lanterns strung between jackfruit trees, sticky rice cakes sweetened extra for luck, toddler laughter looped around them like music. Yet even in the crowd, every brush of Anong's fingers along his sleeve sparked heat. Every time she leaned to answer Anis's question, the subtle arch of her back drew his gaze. By moonrise, they slipped away, returning to their guest house, where new sheets awaited, crisp, cool, smelling of sun drying. Inside the hush, they undressed each other slowly, reverently, as though clothing were petals around a sacred bloom. John's palms roamed the newly cherished landscape of her belly, lingering with awe. Each touch coaxed a tremor up her torso, breasts lifting under quickened breath. He bent to press his ear low against her skin, listening not for heartbeat too early, but for the hush that would one day be filled by it. When he looked up, her eyes were luminous pools reflecting candle flame. She drew him up, guiding him inside with a sigh like wind through prayer flags, soft, urgent, promising. They moved carefully, less for caution than reverence. A slow dance where every shallow thrust, every barely there roll of hips was meant not just for pleasure, but for welcome. Sensation built in gentle swells, cresting in a joint gasp her's airy and light, is a low shudder that rumbled through her bones. They stayed entwined, breath floating between them in steam-soft clouds, until pulse and heartbeat slowed to matching hush. Later, as they drifted toward sleep, rain began again, soft, tentative. John pulled the sheet up, tucking it around her shoulders, then rested his hand over hers, where they both cradled the slight curve that would soon round outward. Her breathing deepened, steady as the river beyond the shutters. He watched candlelight flicker across the blessed string on her wrist, then closed his eyes to the rhythm of two heartbeats, one strong beneath his palm, one only imagined, yet already altering the cadence of their dreams. Outside, rain whispered on roof tiles like a lullaby, and the river kept singing its patient song of currents, forever joining, forever flowing forward toward dawn, toward new life, toward the last sweet chapter still waiting to be told. Late season moonlight poured across the boards like milk when the first flutter pressed against John's palm. They were lying in twilight silence, Anong on her side, belly round, and warm beneath a cotton shift, his hand spread over the gentle hill he'd traced every evening for months. The movement felt like a whispered promise, a tiny ripple, then another. Her breath hitched, eyes shining in the half-dark, and the pulse beneath his fingertips raced to meet her delighted gasp. He bent, lips grazing the taut skin, tasting faint salt, feeling the answering tremor slide up her spine into the curve of his hand at her nape. Days shortened, rice fields turned honey gold. Each dawn he woke to her body nestled along his, the swell of her abdomen rising like a small sun between them. They learned new rhythms, slow walks beneath tamarind boughs, giggling attempts at prenatal yoga that left them collapsed in tangled laughter, nights when desire flared gentler now, but no less urgent. He would kneel, fingertips stroking the small of her back, mouth worshipping the arch where silk stretched over blossoming life. She'd answer with low, breathy moans, palms bracing his shoulders as they rocked together, steady, protective, fierce. When pleasure crested, it was a soft quake that pulsed from her core into his, leaving them panting, foreheads pressed, joined in afterglow and awe. Rainy season broke with a thunder that rattled shutters. On the first storm-swollen afternoon her pain began, a tightening that rippled across her features like distant lightning. John counted breaths, brushed sweat from her brow, kissed the quiver of her lips each time a contraction ebbed. When water finally spilled warm down her thighs, she clutched his wrist, nails biting, breath sawtoothing, and he felt her fear flash like lightning through bone. He steadied her with a thrum of "I'm here," forearms solid beneath her grasp, then bundled her in the tuk-tuk toward Sai's house, where the village midwife waited. Labor widened the night around them. Lamplight flickered, rain drummed steady as a heart. Anong swayed, braced against John's chest, his hands cradling the weight of her belly, as though holding the whole world. Each contraction buckled her knees, each time he bore her weight, whispering breaths across her ear, counting, coaxing, praising the fierce strength coiling through her. Sweat purled on her collarbones. He kissed each bead, tasting storm and jasmine and raw fortitude. When at last she knelt on the floor mat, thighs trembling, the midwife murmured it was time. Anong's eyes locked on John's, dark, shining, terrified, resolute. He slid behind her, knees bracing hers, arms encircling under her ribs, so every shudder ran through him too. She bore down. A guttural cry tore free, broke into ragged panting. He felt her heartbeat slam against his forearms, felt her body surge, and with one final primal roar, the room filled with wet, astonished wailing. Their daughter lay against Anong's chest, skin flushed deep rose, fists curled like tight blossoms. Tears spilled hot down John's cheeks before he realized they'd risen. His breath shook so hard, his shoulders quaked. He pressed his lips to Anong's temple, to the damp tuft of black hair on the tiny crown, tasting salt and vernix and life, so new it hummed. Anong's breath was a stuttered laugh-sob her fingers found his, weaving tight, anchoring them all. Weeks blurred into sweet sour newborn days, soft night feedings by lamplight, lullabies humming over river wind, the musk of milk and bamboo cradle straw. John learned the choreography of fatherhood late, but eagerly, palms memorizing the fragile slope of infant spine, cheeks smoothing over velvet hair, heart ballooning each time gummy lips searched his knuckle. Often he woke before dawn, just to watch mother and child sleeping. Anong's arm curled protectively, baby breathing tiny puffs that lifted linen with featherweight insistence. Desire did not dim, it changed key. One humid midnight, baby finally dozing, Anong drew John onto the veranda, where moonlight pooled in silver squares. She wore only the nursing shawl, loosely knotted. Wind lifted the hem, cool silk brushed his thighs. Her gaze held a soft hunger earthier, deeper born of creation witnessed. He let the shawl slip, hands tracing faint stretch lines like rivers mapping new terrain. She gasped when his thumbs followed the curves back toward her hips, nerves reawakening. The sound flicked heat through him. They moved slowly, quietly, mindful of the cradle inside. She guided him down onto woven mats, straddling his lap, the weight of her grounding him to the timbers beneath. Every rise of her hips drew a muted moan, bodies finding a patient, circling rhythm like water worrying stone. When climax stole upon them, it was a deep tide swell, her breath catching, his answering groans swallowed against her shoulder, so the night heard only rustling leaves. Afterwards, they lay intertwined, sweat cooling in the breeze, her laughter a soft chime as she traced the silver at his temples, now gleaming moon-white. Season bent toward winter, lanterns floated again on the ping, the same festival night that had reunited them. This time, John carried their daughter, her fists grabbing at the crisp evening air. Together, they set a krathong adrift, marigolds, candle, and a single orchid like the one that had first bridged boy to girl 50 years earlier. The boat bobbed away, flame steady. Anong looped her arm through his, leaning until he felt her heartbeat under layers of silk and motherhood and enduring want. He brushed a kiss over her brow. She answered with a sigh that feathered his throat, same breath that had summoned him across decades. Back at their teak house, they laid their child to sleep. The river's lullaby seeped through shutters. In the hush, John traced circles over Anong's palm, marveling at the chronology inside each line. Past, present, tomorrow. She tipped his chin, lips ghosting over his in a slow, familiar communion, breath warming breath, promise renewing itself in the simple miracle of skin meeting skin. Heat stirred quiet, but insistent, thrum of blood recalling every earlier tremor. They slipped onto the futon, bodies molding without haste. Each sigh was a thank you, each touch a prayer of continuing. Later, wrapped in quilt and moonshadow, John listened to the duet of breaths, his wife's steady rhythm, his daughter's soft, hiccuping snores beyond the door. He felt Anong's fingers drift under the blanket, resting over his slowing heart. Her thumb stroked once, twice, sealing the day. He closed his eyes, sinking into the dark, threaded with jasmine and river song, into the truth that had carried them across continents and calendar pages. Some currents, once joined, flow onward together through night, through dawn, through all the sweet days left to taste.